You deserved everything you got. This is a union city.
That is a Philadelphia tradition.
Seize the means of podcasting.
Oh God, the bosses crushed us.
Let me tell you one thing else.
In oldie-timey times,
Who said it? Kanye West or Thomas
we
Paine?
will not raw dog reality for that one.
The pleasure of the flesh is in solidarity.
The Scab Buster.
It's going to be wholly unprofessional.
Eight together strong. Let that be your mantra. So shirt waists were a specific article of clothing that was really popular around the turn of the 20th century. They were also, it was almost an early version of what today we would call fast fashion, and that it was relatively inexpensive, mass-produced, and had terrible labor practices.
Okay.
Much like fast fashion today, a lot of the women that worked in the mills or in the shops making these were they could be as young as like 13. So on November 22nd, 1909, at a rally of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which was specifically for workers making women's clothes. So this was both women and men in the union. But they were all working to make women's clothes. So, November 22nd, 1909, there was an ILGWU rally in New York. And Clara Lemlich, who's a 23-year-old Ukrainian Jewish immigrant, stood up in front of all of the workers there and called for a strike. They voted on the spot. Strike went through, or the strike vote went through. And the next day, 15,000 workers walked out in New York.
Wow.
This was what became known as the Uprising of the 20,000. So the strike continued, but the factory owners, or the business owners, in their craftiness, started shifting their production to Philadelphia. So it used to be that New York was kind of the powerhouse. But most of these owners, or most of these company owners, also had factories elsewhere or could contract out the work. So they started to increase the work that they were giving to Philadelphia because the workers in Philly weren't on strike.
Okay.
But the ILGWU members in Philly realized that this was going on, and with encouragement from strikers or from representatives coming down from New York City, they called a strike in Philly, on December 20th. There were 12,000 garment industry workers in Philly. Of those, 7,000 walked out in solidarity, so went out on strike. There were mostly Jewish immigrants from the Pale of Settlement, and it's also important to note most of them were women. There were a lot of girls. And ages ranged from teenagers up into middle-aged. They actually got a surprising amount of support and solidarity within the city, but not from a lot of the Jewish community, because there's a weird rift within the Jewish community in terms of being a wealthier German Jew, who the German Jews immigrated earlier, or generally immigrated earlier, tended to be wealthier. Most of the business owners were German Jews, or most of the Jewish business owners were German, I should say. The more established Jewish community was also much more assimilated, and they would be speaking English. They weren't very outwardly Jewish, but these immigrants that were coming over tended to speak Yiddish as their primary language. They also tended to be a lot more radical, because there were a lot of radical politics moving around in Eastern Europe at the time. So class and wealth divisions within an ethnic minority. And and ethnic divisions as well.
What a recipe.
But they had support from a lot of reform groups and from middle and upper class suffragettes. I should also say there were a lot of
Here we go.
suffragettes and women's rights activists who were like, we support the strike, or we support the demands of the strikers, but we don't like how they're going about it because it's too radical. But one cool thing that happened was Helen Taft, the daughter of President Taft, actually attended or was part of a commission to support the striking women while she was studying at Bryn Mawr College. And there were actually female students from Bryn Mawr College that got arrested for being out on the picket line.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so there was some bougie upper class support among certain groups of women for the strikers. There were some really cool stories that came out of the strike too. My favorite one is the president of the Markers and Cleaners Union, Bessie Hyman. She was only 15 at the time, which crazy that she was the president of the union. She was one of the strikers, but she actually left the picket line to go and get hired at Haber and Company, which was one of the companies that was like most virulently opposed to the strike, and hired a lot of, or didn't have a lot of organized women in their shop. So she got hired there and then started to organize the strike breakers in the factory.
I like her.
And then they found out, or Haber and Company found out, and like basically physically dragged her out of the factory and kicked her out. So then during the strike, there was also a fire that broke out in January and at a shop on Dock Street. And this was, theoretically was a factory, but it was just a converted warehouse where they built a second floor and then put up a bunch of wooden partitions inside. So it was not, the building was not intended to have a large amount of people working in it. But of course they did because it was cheap. There was a pretty big fire that broke out there, and there was only one staircase to escape the building. So a lot of the women fell out of the windows in an attempt to escape.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, there were multiple deaths.
Oh, man.
Lots of injuries. And actually, the building owner's two daughters were among the dead, along with two women who had been on the picket line, I think a week prior, but had to return to work basically because their families were starving. So Abraham Rosenberg, the president of the ILGWU, announced the news of this fire and the two deaths the next day, and at a basically overflowing meeting in Philly. And that kind of re-galvanized everyone because it was the middle of, or late January. It was cold. Everybody just wanted to go home. So during all of this, the city government was pretty corrupt.
Was?
I mean,
I'm sorry, did I say something?
It still is.
I thought that was my internal monologue. I apologize.
So the director of public safety was basically trying to drive more division between the strikers and the local populace.
Like you do.
Yeah, the normal things. So he started collecting information on all of the arrestees. There were 285, or of the 285 women who were arrested that he looked up, 238 were Russian-born Jews, and only 13 were native to the U.S. or were born in the U.S. Ooh. So it's all these dangerous immigrants coming over here and demanding living wages. But the socialist newspaper in New York, The Call, responded to that.
Now who's It's fucking things up.
Yeah. With the fantastic headline that Philadelphia safety director discovers that the waste strikers did not come over on the Mayflower. So then Haber, Mr. Haber, the owner of Haber and Company, which was that company that kicked out Bessie Hyman, explicitly said that he would only hire Gentile women in the future. He said, and he said that they were generally smarter. So,
Yeah.
super great guy. Really someone that you could negotiate with there. I'll also say there were some failings within the union. That there was also a sizable Italian immigrant community, was generally not as well organized as the Jewish immigrant ones, or the Jewish immigrant community. And one of the main problems there was that a lot of the union meetings were being held in Yiddish. And that language is really only spoken by Eastern European Jews.
All the Italians don't know Yiddish?
It's, you'd think they would just learn it. But so as the strike wore on and the winter wore on, some of the women and girls were forced to go back to work, mostly because they started the strike in extreme poverty and were still in extreme poverty after 2 months of no work.
Yeah, that ain't going to change anything.
No.
For you.
So they had to go back to work to support their families and to feed themselves. And there were, of course, mutual aids and support societies, but that can only go so far. Others started to return to work as businesses actually accepted the terms of the strikers, which were mostly better conditions, better pay, and arbitration for future negotiations. So that wasn't really full union recognition, but it was at least you had a way to voice grievances and get something done.
Yeah, the foot in the door, sure.
Yeah. And one of the really big victories, and this is one of the just absurd business practices of the time, which I'm sure people are still doing today, was they would no longer be charged for the needles that they used to make the garments. So they were basically paying for the privilege of using the machines that their bosses owned so that they could work for their boss. So they put an end to that, and they were no longer getting charged for the consumables.
Well, I'm happy for them.
Yeah. During production.
Because that's insane.
Yeah, so the strike basically ended on February 5th, 1910. It was mostly victorious. If I'm not mistaken, most of the bosses conceded. They definitely won a lot of really good things.